Have you ever felt like you were living in the shadow of someone else's spotlight? Like no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't measure up in the eyes of the very people who were supposed to cherish you most. I'm Clara, and if you've ever known the quiet ache of family favoritism or the profound sting of betrayal, then my story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from, because this is a story about finding your worth when others refuse to see it. I was born into a world of polished surfaces and whispered expectations. Our sprawling estate in upstate New York, the Hawthorns, was a testament to generations of old money managed with an iron fist by my father, Arthur, and my mother, Victoria. From my earliest memories, a pattern was etched into the very fabric of our family. My younger sister, Serafina, was the sun around which our world revolved. I, it seemed, was merely a distant star, barely visible in her brilliant glow. When I brought home a perfect report card from elementary school, my father would offer a perfunctory nod, perhaps a "good job, Clara." But when Serafina, 4 years my junior, received a single A amongst her mediocre grades, it sparked a family celebration. "Serafina has been working so diligently," my mother would exclaim, beaming. "She deserves every bit of this recognition." I would sit at the grand dining table, pushing exquisite food around my plate, a bitter taste in my mouth, wondering what made my quiet accomplishments so much less worthy. My solace lay a mere hour's drive away, nestled amidst rolling hills, my grandparents, Agnes and Walter Sterling. Their charming lake house, filled with inherited treasures and the comforting scent of pine and old books, was my sanctuary. Unlike my parents, who often seemed to look through me, my grandparents always saw me. Grandma Agnes would listen intently, her kind eyes meeting mine, asking probing questions about my nascent passions. Grandpa Walter, with his booming laugh, would affectionately call me our little philosopher, valuing my curiosity above all else. I still remember Thanksgiving when I was 12. I'd just won the regional debate championship, a feat that had taken months of relentless preparation. "Arthur, Victoria, you missed Clara's debate final yesterday," Grandma Agnes had stated, her voice sharper than usual. "She was absolutely brilliant." We were there, but she kept scanning the crowd, hoping you'd arrive. My father had waved a dismissive hand. "Mother, we had Serafina's dance showcase. You know how crucial her ballet is for her future. Clara understands." Grandpa Walter had interjected, his voice laced with indignation. "Does she?" The girl looked crestfallen. My mother had sighed dramatically. "Agnes, Walter, please. We love both our girls equally. They just have different needs." Even then, a knot formed in my stomach. Serafina needed constant affirmation. I, apparently, needed to accept my invisibility. As we navigated our teenage years, the disparity grew into a chasm. Serafina developed an uncanny knack for strategic manipulation. If I mentioned my dream of attending a prestigious Ivy League university, Serafina would suddenly declare the same aspiration, prompting my parents to funnel vast sums into specialized tutors and elite prep courses for her. When I won a national short story competition in high school, Serafina developed a sudden, dramatic allergy attack on the day of the award ceremony. My parents, naturally, stayed home with her, missing my moment of recognition entirely. "Your sister is simply more delicate than you," my mother explained, as if it were a compliment. "You're resilient, Clara. You can handle these things on your own." Being labeled resilient became a crushing burden. It meant I deserved less. Less attention, less emotional investment, less love. By the time college applications loomed, I had deeply internalized the need to earn their elusive approval. Though my soul yearned for literature, I pursued economics, chasing a fleeting remark from my father about his admiration for financially astute women. I graduated magna cum laude from a top-tier university, still clinging to the desperate hope that this achievement, finally, would be enough. My parents attended, but departed early, excusing themselves because Serafina, who had barely scraped through high school and was on a self-discovery gap year, had called, complaining of profound loneliness. Throughout these years, my grandparents remained my steadfast emotional anchors. When my parents skipped my high school graduation for Serafina's minor car dinga fender bender that somehow warranted days of parental panic, Grandma Agnes and Grandpa Walter not only attended but hosted a joyous celebration at their Sarah home. "You are exceptional, Clara," Grandpa Walter declared, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Never forget that your worth isn't determined by others' ability to see it." Those words became my shield, my silent mantra against the relentless disappointments. My grandparents' lake house became my refuge. Every other weekend, I'd make the drive from my tiny city apartment, feeling the suffocating weight of inadequacy begin to lift the moment I turned onto their winding, tree-lined driveway. Their home, unlike the sterile perfection of my parents' mansion, hummed with life, filled with treasured mementos and the comforting scent of freshly baked cookies. "There she is, our brilliant girl," Grandpa Walter would announce as I walked through the door, his pride a consistent, unwavering force, independent of any specific accomplishment. During my second year of college, when I called my parents, desperate for tuition help after losing a scholarship due to budget cuts, my mother had sighed heavily. "Clara, we've already committed to covering Serafina's entire artistic education. You know she needs the support more than you. Can't you just take out additional loans? You're studying economics, after all. You'll pay them back eventually." I didn't tell them I had lost the scholarship because I'd spent countless hours helping Serafina with her university applications, neglecting my own perfect GPA. Helping my sister had felt like a desperate plea for approval. Instead, it had cost me dearly. 2 days later, Grandpa Walter called. "Clara, I'd like to discuss an investment opportunity with you," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Your grandmother and I would like to invest in your education. We believe the returns will be substantial." When I protested, overwhelmed with gratitude, Grandma Agnes got on the line. "Darling, this isn't charity, this is belief in your future. Sometimes, family means recognizing potential and nurturing it. Let us do this." They paid not only for the remainder of my undergraduate education but also for my master's in finance. During those years, my financial education extended far beyond the classroom. On those weekend visits, Grandpa Walter would invite me into his study, a room steeped in history, smelling of aged leather and antique paper. Our family fortune wasn't always managed wisely. He confided one rainy afternoon. "Your great-grandmother nearly lost everything in the crash of '29. It was her shrewd investments, made secretly, that saved this family. Women weren't supposed to understand finance then, but she did." He pulled out dusty ledgers, stock certificates, and family financial histories, teaching me not just about wealth management but about our family's complex, often fraught, relationship with money. These lessons continued for years, and I gradually realized he was preparing me for something significant, though I couldn't grasp what. Meanwhile, Grandma Agnes focused on a different, equally vital education. She shared family lore, values, and traditions. On Sunday mornings, we would sit in her sun-drenched conservatory, drinking herbal tea from delicate cups that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother. "Family is more than blood or inheritance," she would say, her eyes kind, yet strangely evaluating. "It's about character, about doing right by each other, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." During one such conversation, when I was 27, she broached a subject we usually avoided. "Your parents love you, Clara," she said carefully. "They just don't understand you. Some people can only see reflections of themselves. Serafina mirrors your mother's insecurities and your father's need for admiration. You've always been more like Walter and mean-dependent, perhaps a bit too self-sufficient for your own good." "They've always favored her," I admitted softly. The admission still painful, even after all those years. Grandma Agnes didn't deny it. "Yes. And that's their failure, not yours. Walter and I have noticed. We've tried to speak with them about it over the years, but some patterns become too comfortable to break. There was a hint of steely resolve in her tone that day, making me wonder about the hushed battles fought behind closed doors. With my grandparents' unwavering guidance and support, I built a successful career as a financial analyst. By 30, I was making partner at a prestigious firm in New York City, specializing in ethical investments. When I called my parents to share the news, my father sounded distracted. "That's nice, Clara. Listen, Serafina is thinking about launching her own online boutique. Would you mind giving her some business advice? You know, numbers aren't her strong suit." It was always like this. My accomplishments were merely stepping stones to elevate Serafina. Yet, with my grandparents, I found true validation and genuine support. The last time I saw my grandparents together was at their 60th wedding anniversary celebration, just 3 months before the accident. It was an intimate gathering at their lake house, conspicuously absent of my parents and Serafina, who had a prior engagement related to Serafina's boutique launch. After dinner, Grandpa Walter pulled me aside. At 84, he moved more slowly, but his mind remained a sharp, incisive instrument. "Clara, your grandmother and I have been discussing the future," he said, his voice lower than usual. "We're not getting any younger, and there are matters we need to ensure are properly arranged." "Grandpa, I don't want to talk about this," I protested, the thought of losing them too agonizing to contemplate. "I know, my dear, but wisdom means confronting difficult truths. We've made certain decisions that may surprise some people, but they shouldn't surprise you." He squeezed my hand. "Just know that everything we've done has been with careful consideration and deep love." Grandma Agnes joined us, linking her arm with mine. "We're immensely proud of the woman you've become, Clara. Whatever happens in the future, never doubt that." Their words felt hauntingly like a farewell, though I dismissed the feeling then. I didn't realize they were laying the groundwork for the brutal battle that would soon engulf our family. The call came on a grim Tuesday morning in November. I was preparing for a crucial client meeting when my phone lit up with my mother's number, an unusual occurrence that made me pause, my heart seizing. Her voice was controlled but strained. "Clara, there's been an accident. Your grandparents were driving back from their vacation home. The roads were slick from the rain." Her voice trailed off into a fragile whisper. "Mom?" My hand gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Are they okay?" The silence stretched an eternity. Then, a broken sob. "No, Clara. They're gone. Both of them." The next few days blurred into a haze of raw grief and logistical arrangements. I took immediate leave from work, driving back to New York, my vision occasionally blurring with tears as memories of those treasured weekend visits flooded my mind. The thought of never again seeing Grandpa Walter's warm smile or feeling Grandma Agnes's gentle hand on my shoulder left a physical ache in my chest. When I arrived at my parents' house, Serafina was already there, her eyes swollen and red. For a brief, fleeting moment, our shared loss seemed to transcend our complex history. We embraced, a fragile connection forged in mutual sorrow. That moment, however, was tragically short-lived. "I can't believe they're gone." Serafina wailed dramatically in the living room, surrounded by well-meaning neighbors bringing condolence casseroles. They were like second parents to me. I bit my tongue, knowing Serafina had visited our grandparents perhaps twice a year, usually when she needed a financial handout or was between relationships, craving attention. My weekly visits and profound bond with them went unmentioned, unacknowledged. The memorial service was elegant and somber, befitting two people who had lived with such dignity. I was asked to deliver one of the eulogies, a responsibility that both honored and terrified me. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I spoke from the depths of my heart about two people who had shaped my very being. "Agnes and Walter Sterling didn't just teach me about our family history," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "They taught me about integrity, about quiet strength, and about loving without conditions. They saw people for who they truly were and valued authentic connection above all else." From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother shift uncomfortably in the front pew. Beside her, my father stared stonily ahead, his expression unreadable. 3 days after the service, Mr. Davies, my grandparents' attorney of 30 years, requested the family's presence at his office for the reading of the will. The atmosphere in his elegant, wood-paneled office was thick with tension as my parents, Serafina, and I took seats around a polished conference table. Mr. Davies, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind, discerning eyes, began with formal condolences before opening a leather portfolio. "Before I begin the specific distributions," he stated, "I should note that Agnes and Walter Sterling's estate is substantial, valued at approximately $30 million, including properties, investments, and personal assets." My mother gasped audibly. Even I was surprised by the figure, though Grandpa Walter had given me hints about their significant financial position over the years. Mr. Davies continued. To their granddaughter, Serafina Thorne, they leave their charming lakeside cottage in Vermont, valued at approximately $1.5 million, along with a cash gift of $750,000. Serafina smiled through her tears, glancing triumphantly at me. I remained expressionless, waiting. To their son, Arthur Thorne, and daughter-in-law, Victoria Thorne, they leave their collection of rare books and historical artifacts, valued at approximately $2.5 million, as well as a cash gift of $1.5 million. My father nodded, his expression calculating. My mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Mr. Davies cleared his throat before continuing, his gaze settling on me. And to their granddaughter, Clara Thorne, they leave the primary residence, the Hawthorns, valued at $5 million. Their investment portfolio, valued at approximately $16 million. Their remaining cash assets of approximately $4.5 million, and all remaining personal effects not specifically designated elsewhere. The silence in the room was absolute for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, my mother's voice shattered it like glass. "There must be some mistake," she cried, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Mr. Davies looked at her calmly. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Thorne. The will is quite clear and was updated just 5 months ago, with Agnes and Walter of sound mind and body witnessed appropriately. But that's not fair." Serafina burst out, her previous satisfaction evaporating into a torrent of indignant tears. Why would they leave Clara almost everything? I was their granddaughter too. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. While I had known my grandparents cherished our relationship, I never expected this level of disparity in their final wishes. The inheritance was truly life-changing, but I already recognized it would come with an unbearable cost to family relationships. "This is outrageous." My father finally spoke, his voice cold and hard. My parents would never have intentionally created such an imbalance. Clara must have influenced them somehow. It felt as though I'd been slapped. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice trembling. Mr. Davies interrupted before the situation could escalate further. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, I should inform you that Agnes and Walter anticipated this reaction. They left a letter explaining their decisions, which I have been instructed to read only if their distributions were questioned." "Read it," my mother demanded, her face a mask of fury. Mr. Davies opened a sealed, crisp envelope and began reading in a measured, deliberate tone. "To our beloved family, if this letter is being read, it means our decisions have been questioned. We want to be unequivocally clear that we have made these choices with full awareness and careful consideration over many years. Our distributions reflect not only our deep relationships with each family member but also our assessment of needs, previous significant gifts given during our lifetime, and our confidence in each recipient's ability to responsibly manage their inheritance. We love you all, but we have chosen to allocate our estate in the manner we believe best serves everyone's long-term interests and honors the values we hold dear. We ask that you respect our wishes and maintain family harmony. With eternal love, Agnes and Walter Sterling." My mother's face had turned an alarming shade of crimson. Serafina was openly sobbing now, mascara tracking paths down her flushed cheeks. My father stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape. "This isn't over," he stated flatly, his eyes narrowed. "We'll be contesting this will." As we left the attorney's office, the divide in our family had never felt wider or more unbridgeable. What should have been a time of shared mourning had become the opening salvo in what would become an ugly, soul-wrenching battle over money, fairness, and the very definition of family loyalty. I drove back to my apartment that evening with my grandparents' words echoing in my mind, wondering if they had truly anticipated the storm their meticulously planned decisions would unleash. The campaign began subtly. 3 days after the reading of the will, my mother called, her voice honeyed in a way that immediately put me on high alert. "Clara, darling, I hope you're doing well with everything that's happened," she began, a false sweetness in her tone. "Your father and I have been thinking about what Grandma and Grandpa would really want for our family." I remained silent, waiting for the inevitable hook. "You know Serafina has been struggling financially with her boutique startup, and that inheritance, well, it's really quite excessive for one person, don't you think? Surely you plan to share some of it with your sister." That would be the right thing to do. The implication was clear. If I didn't voluntarily redistribute my inheritance, I was selfish, greedy, and morally deficient. "Mom, I'm still processing Grandma and Grandpa's death," I replied carefully, trying to keep my voice even. "I haven't made any decisions about the inheritance yet." Her tone chilled immediately. "I see. Well, I hope you'll consider what's fair for the entire family, not just yourself." The calls increased in frequency, alternating between my mother's emotional manipulation and my father's more direct, chilling approach. "Clara, this situation is creating unnecessary tension in the family," he stated during one particularly strained conversation. "Serafina is your sister. Blood should mean something to you." When phone calls proved ineffective, they escalated to an ambush dinner. I arrived at their estate one Sunday evening to find not only my parents and Serafina but also my father's brother, Uncle David, his wife, Aunt Carol, and their daughter, my cousin Beth. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken judgment as we took our seats around the formal dining table. "We thought it would be good to have a family discussion," my mother announced after a painfully silent appetizer course. What followed was a coordinated attack. Uncle David droned on about family loyalty. Aunt Carol tearfully described how devastated Serafina was, and Serafina herself alternated between sullen silence and tearful accusations about how I had always been the favorite of our grandparents. Only my father's sister, Aunt Julia, who arrived late and hadn't been briefed on the intervention plan, seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings. "I don't understand why we're discussing Agnes and Walter's private decisions as if they're up for a family vote," she said, frowning at my father. They were of sound mind and had every right to distribute their estate as they saw fit. "Julia, you don't understand the situation," my mother replied dismissively. Clara clearly influenced them inappropriately by visiting them regularly and showing genuine interest in their lives. Aunt Julia raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That doesn't sound inappropriate to me." I shot her a grateful look as the dinner disintegrated into tense, whispered arguments. Driving home that night, I felt more isolated than ever, but also more resolved to honor my grandparents' final wishes. The next phase of manipulation came in the form of thinly veiled threats. A week after the disastrous dinner, my father called. "Clara, our attorney has advised us that we have grounds to contest the will based on undue influence," he stated without preamble. "Before we proceed with legal action, I wanted to give you one more opportunity to come to a reasonable arrangement with your sister." "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "Transfer half of the financial assets to Serafina, and we'll drop the matter." When I didn't immediately agree, the threats escalated. Their family lawyer, Mr. Gallagher, sent a formal letter outlining their intent to contest the will, citing my suspicious level of involvement with my grandparents in their final years. Meanwhile, Serafina had begun her own insidious campaign, contacting mutual friends and extended family to share her twisted version of events. According to her narrative, I had cunningly manipulated our elderly grandparents, isolating them from the loving family and poisoning them against her. These vicious rumors reached me through my cousin, Sarah, who called to warn me. "I don't believe any of it, Clara," Sarah assured me, her voice gentle. "But Serafina is telling everyone who will listen that you practically held Grandma and Grandpa hostage during their last years. That's absurd," I replied, the hurt cutting deep. "She barely visited them. She was too busy with her own life to make time for them." Sarah hesitated before continuing. "There's more, Clara. Aunt Victoria and Uncle Arthur have been saying things too. Did you know they tried to get Grandma and Grandpa to change their will last year? Apparently, there was a huge argument about it. This was news to me, a painful, illuminating revelation." "What? When did this happen?" "Around Christmas, I think. Grandpa Walter refused to discuss it with them after that. Mom overheard them arguing about it at the New Year's party. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. My grandparents' slightly strained relationship with my parents over the past year. Their cryptic comments about difficult decisions. The way Grandpa Walter had seemed especially determined to ensure I understood the family finances. The ultimate betrayal came in the form of cold, impersonal court documents. My parents formally filed a lawsuit contesting the will, claiming I had exerted undue influence over my grandparents, that they had lacked the capacity to make sound decisions, and, most painfully, that I had emotionally manipulated them by fabricating stories about family mistreatment. Seeing these accusations in black and white legal language felt like a physical blow, a vicious punch to my very core. The family that should have been united in grief was now irreparably divided by greed, resentment, and a chilling lack of self-awareness. Serafina refused to speak to me except through lawyers. My parents treated me as if I were a criminal who had stolen from the family, rather than their daughter who was simply honoring her grandparents' wishes. The night after being served with the lawsuit, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by photo albums of happier, simpler times. There was Grandpa Walter teaching me to fish by the lake when I was 8. Grandma Agnes and me baking cookies in her sun-drenched kitchen. Family Christmases when the tensions weren't quite so visible, hidden beneath layers of tradition. I traced their smiling faces with my finger, tears blurring my vision. "I miss you both so much," I whispered to their photographs. "I wish you were here to help me through this." In that moment of despair, my phone rang. It was Mr. Davies, my grandparents' attorney. "Clara, I've just been made aware of the lawsuit," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I think it's time we discuss some additional information your grandparents left in my keeping. Information they hoped would never be necessary to reveal, but which they prepared just in case." His words ignited a small, flickering flame of hope in the suffocating darkness that had enveloped me since the reading of the will. Perhaps my grandparents, wise and forward-thinking as always, had indeed anticipated this brutal battle and prepared accordingly. The courthouse loomed before me, its gray stone facade imposing and cold. Despite the warm June day, I felt chilled to the bone as I climbed the steps, Mr. Davies at my side. We had spent weeks preparing for this hearing, the first major confrontation in what promised to be a protracted legal battle. "Remember what we discussed, Mr. Simons for VEZZO," Davies said quietly as we approached the courtroom doors. "Let the evidence speak for itself. Try not to take their accusations personally, though I know that's asking a lot." Inside, my parents and Serafina were already seated at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, Miss Bethany Reed, a sharp-featured woman known for aggressive tactics in inheritance disputes. Serafina avoided my gaze, studying her manicured nails with intense focus. My mother stared straight ahead, her posture rigid, a picture of stony defiance. Only my father glanced my way, his expression a mixture of grim determination and something that might have been fleeting regret. As Judge Evelyn Stone entered and the proceedings began, I tried to steady my breathing. "Miss Reed opened with a scathing characterization of me as a manipulative granddaughter who had systematically isolated elderly, vulnerable grandparents from their loving family. "Your Honor, Miss," Reed argued, her voice dripping with scorn, "the evidence will show that Clara Thorne took advantage of Agnes and Walter Sterling's advanced age and declining health to secure an outrageously disproportionate inheritance for herself. She visited them excessively, inserted herself into their financial affairs, and created friction between them and the rest of their loving family." The term loving family made me clench my jaw so hard it ached. When it was Mr. Davies's turn to speak, his approach was markedly different, calm, measured, and devastatingly effective. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, I have documentation that Agnes and Walter Sterling anticipated this very situation and left specific instructions and evidence with me as their longtime attorney. With the court's permission, I would like to submit this evidence now, as it directly addresses the claims being made." Judge Stone nodded her approval, and Mr. Davies presented a sealed, heavy envelope to the court clerk. The first item is a detailed financial history of gifts and support provided by Agnes and Walter Sterling to all family members over the past 20 years. Mr. Davies explained. This document was meticulously maintained by Walter Sterling, a former financial analyst, and updated quarterly. As the judge reviewed the document, her eyebrows raised slightly. She looked over her reading glasses at my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, were your clients aware that according to these records, Serafina Thorne has already received gifts totaling over $2.5 million from her grandparents during their lifetime? Or that they paid for her entire art education, her first 2 failed business ventures, and covered significant personal debts on 9 separate occasions?" Miss Reed looked startled, turning to confer hurriedly with my parents. My mother's face had paled considerably, her defiant posture crumbling. "Furthermore," Mr. Davies continued, his voice unwavering, "the second document is a series of confidential letters between Agnes Sterling and several esteemed family counselors over the past decade, in which she repeatedly expresses profound concern about the family dynamics, particularly the consistent favoritism shown towards Serafina and the emotional neglect of Clara." Judge Stone spent several intense minutes reading through these letters, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "The third item," Mr. Davies said, his voice now imbued with a quiet power, "is perhaps most relevant to the claims of undue influence. It is a video recording made by Agnes and Walter Sterling just 3 months before their passing, specifically addressing their estate decisions." The courtroom fell silent, a palpable tension filling the air as a screen was set up. My heart raced as my grandparents' faces appeared, looking serious but resolute, projected for all to see. Grandpa Walter spoke first, his voice strong despite his age. "We are recording this statement on the 10th of October, 2023, of our own free will and with full mental capacity. We wish to address our decision regarding the distribution of our estate." Grandma Agnes continued, her gentle voice filling the silent room. "We have made a deliberate choice to leave the majority of our estate to our granddaughter, Clara. This decision was not made lightly or without consideration for all members of our family." They proceeded to explain, in clear, sometimes painful detail, their reasoning. They discussed Serafina's previous lavish financial gifts and her consistent pattern of irresponsibility with money. They mentioned my parents' comfortable financial position and their undeniable, consistent favoritism towards Serafina throughout our childhoods. Most surprisingly, they revealed that my parents had approached them multiple times in recent years, not for loans, but demanding early inheritances that were never truly repaid, despite promises. "We love all our family," Grandpa Walter stated firmly, his gaze steady. "But love doesn't mean ignoring reality or enabling harmful patterns. Clara has consistently shown responsibility, care, and genuine affection without financial motivation. Our decision reflects our deepest values and our hope for the legacy we leave behind." As the video ended, I wiped away tears, a silent testament to the raw emotion in the room. Even from beyond the grave, they were protecting me, validating what I had always felt but never fully expressed about our family dynamics. The courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Serafina was openly crying now, but her tears seemed different, less performative, perhaps even born of dawning shame. My father stared at the blank screen, his expression unreadable. My mother looked away, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line. Miss Reed conferred in hushed tones with my parents before addressing the court. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, my clients would like to request a brief recess to consult. Judge Stone agreed, and as we filed out of the courtroom, Mr. Davies squeezed my shoulder supportively. There's more, he whispered, if needed. During the recess, I stood alone in a quiet corridor, processing the morning's seismic revelations. To my surprise, Serafina approached, her makeup smeared, her voice small and uncertain. Did you know? She asked. About the video. About all of it. I shook my head, my throat tight. I knew Grandma and Grandpa had concerns, but not the extent of it. Serafina nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Mom and Dad told me you were manipulating them, that you were lying about me to them. She looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. I believed them, because it was easier than admitting they pushed me to demand more than I deserved. Before I could respond, Miss Reed approached with my parents, indicating the recess was ending. As we re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Miss Reed addressed the judge immediately. Your Honor, in light of the overwhelming evidence presented, my clients would like to withdraw their petition contesting the will. Judge Stone looked at my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, is this your wish? My father nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Very well, Judge Stone replied, but her tone suggested the matter wasn't entirely settled. Before I dismiss this case, I feel compelled to note that the evidence presented today suggests a deeply troubling pattern of family dynamics. The court strongly recommends family counseling. As we left the courtroom, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and profound sadness. I had won, but at what cost? The family I had always hoped would someday truly accept me now stood further away than ever. Yet, for the first time, the brutal truth about our relationships had been spoken aloud, impossible to ignore or minimize any longer. Mr. Davies walked me to my car. Your grandparents were remarkable people, Clara. They saw this coming years ago and prepared accordingly, but they always hoped it wouldn't be necessary to reveal everything publicly. Thank you for everything, I said, my voice thick with emotion. There's one more thing, he added, handing me a small, sealed envelope. Agnes asked me to give you this privately, after everything was settled, for your eyes only. I sat in my car long after Mr. Davies had gone, holding the unopened envelope from Grandma Agnes, feeling as though I stood at a crossroads between a painful past and an uncertain future. The envelope remained unopened on my coffee table for 3 days. Each time I reached for it, something held me back, a mix of anticipation and dread about its contents. Finally, on a quiet Sunday morning that reminded me of countless serene breakfasts with Grandma Agnes, I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter in my grandmother's elegant, familiar script, dated just 1 month before the accident. My dearest Clara, it began. If you're reading this, then our suspicions were unfortunately correct, and your inheritance has caused the family conflict we feared, but prepared for. First, please know that your grandfather and I made our decisions with complete clarity and conviction. We were not manipulated or confused. We simply saw the truth of our family and acted accordingly. What you don't know, what we kept even from Mr. Davies until recently, is that we created a secondary trust with specific conditions. This trust contains an additional $6 million, currently held separately from your primary inheritance. This money is designated for family healing, with 3 specific provisions. First, if your parents and Serafina contested the will and then withdrew their contestas, we anticipated they might, once our video was shown, this money is to be offered to them under specific conditions. They must agree to family counseling for a minimum of 18 months. They must acknowledge, in writing, the patterns of favoritism and unfair treatment that have characterized your relationship since childhood, and they must commit to making genuine amends. Second, if they refuse these conditions, the money will instead fund a foundation in our name, dedicated to supporting neglected or overlooked children with exceptional potential, with you as the sole director. Third, regardless of their choice, $1.5 million from this trust is designated exclusively for you to use as you see fit, with no conditions attached. This is our gift to you for the years of quiet pain you endured while maintaining your dignity and compassion. The choice of whether to reveal this additional trust to your parents and Serafina is entirely yours. You may decide that clean boundaries are healthier than attempted reconciliation. We would understand completely if that is your choice. Whatever you decide, we trust your judgment implicitly. Remember what I told you in the conservatory that spring afternoon. Family is about character, about doing right by each other even when it's difficult. You have always exemplified the best character in our family, Clara. We couldn't be prouder of the woman you've become. With all my love, Grandma Agnes. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Even now, they were teaching me, guiding me, offering wisdom about family healing while respecting my autonomy to choose my path forward. The surprise trust was ingenious, creating both consequences for my parents' behavior and a powerful incentive for genuine change. 2 days later, I met with Mr. Davies to discuss the secondary trust. They were remarkable strategists, he acknowledged with a sad smile. They hoped the video alone would be enough, but they prepared this backup plan just in case. The question now is whether you want to reveal its existence to your parents and Serafina. I considered carefully before answering. Yes. Not because I believe they deserve more money, but because I think Grandma Agnes was right about the potential for healing, however slim. The conditions are fair, and the choice will be theirs. Mr. Davies nodded approvingly. I'll arrange a meeting. The meeting took place in Mr. Davies' office the following week. My parents arrived looking subdued, the courtroom revelations having evidently impacted their usual confidence. Serafina entered separately, giving me a hesitant nod of acknowledgement. Mr. Davies explained the secondary trust and its conditions methodically. As he spoke, I watched the expressions shift on my family members' faces, from initial surprise to calculating assessment, then to uncertain, fragile hope. So, to be clear, my father said when Mr. Davies finished, if we agree to counseling and acknowledge the, family dynamics Clara has felt, there would be additional inheritance for Serafina and us. That is correct. Mr. Davies confirmed. Though I should emphasize that the acknowledgement must be genuine, and the counseling commitment fulfilled before any funds are distributed. Agnes and Walter were very specific about this. My mother looked at me directly for perhaps the first time since the will reading. And this was your grandparents' decision, not yours? Yes. I replied simply, though whether to tell you about it was my choice. Serafina spoke up, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. Why would you choose to tell us, after everything we said about you, the lawsuit, the rumors, why offer us anything? I considered my answer carefully, choosing my words with deliberate intent. Because Grandma Agnes believed in the possibility of healing, even in the most broken relationships. And because, despite everything, you're still my family. The room fell silent as the implications of my words sank in. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about truth, accountability, and the possibility of a new kind of relationship, built on honesty rather than pretense. We'll need time to discuss this, my father finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Of course, Mr. Davies replied. The offer remains open for 30 days. As we prepared to leave, Mr. Davies handed me another envelope. One final item your grandmother left for you. She asked that I give you this only after the secondary trust was revealed. Alone in my apartment that evening, I opened this last message from my grandmother. Inside was a single, faded photograph I'd never seen before, showing Grandma Agnes as a young woman standing proudly beside her own grandmother. On the back, in elegant script, was written, "Family patterns can be broken. My grandmother showed me the way when my own parents couldn't. Now I pass that wisdom to you." Some inheritances are worth more than money. I traced their faces with my finger, understanding now that the true inheritance my grandparents had left wasn't the millions in my bank account, but the profound wisdom, unwavering love, and extraordinary foresight they had demonstrated throughout their lives and beyond. They had created a path for possible reconciliation, while ensuring I would be protected, regardless of the outcome. 3 days later, Serafina called me, asking to meet for coffee alone. It was the first, tentative step on what would prove to be a long, complicated journey toward a new kind of family relationship built on truth rather than comfortable illusions. 23 days after learning about the secondary trust, my parents formally accepted its conditions. The letter acknowledging their favoritism must have been excruciating for them to write, particularly for my mother, whose handwriting grew increasingly unsteady toward the end of the 3-page document. We recognized that we consistently prioritized Serafina's needs and desires above Clara's. One particularly difficult paragraph read, "We celebrated Serafina's achievements while taking Clara's for granted." We justified this disparity by telling ourselves that Clara was stronger and needed less support, when, in reality, every child deserves equal love and recognition. We failed as parents to provide this basic fairness. Our first family counseling session was scheduled for the following week with Dr. Eleanor Vance, a specialist in family estrangement and reconciliation. Walking into her warm, simply furnished office felt like crossing a threshold into unknown territory. My father sat stiffly on one end of the couch, my mother perched nervously beside him. Serafina chose an armchair rather than sitting next to me on the love seat, small but noticeable statement about where we still stood. "Before we begin, Dr. Vance said after introductions, I want to acknowledge the unusual circumstances that brought you here. Financial incentives for therapy aren't ideal motivators, but they don't invalidate the work we might accomplish together. The question is whether, beyond the conditions of the trust, there's genuine desire for healing in this room." The silence that followed was telling. Eventually, to my surprise, it was Serafina who spoke first. "I want to try," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, "even if we weren't getting anything from it." Over the following months, our weekly sessions became a sacred space for painful truths and gradual understanding. Progress wasn't linear. Some sessions ended with tears and slammed doors. Others brought small, fragile breakthrough moments of genuine connection that had eluded us for decades. During our 3rd month of counseling, my mother broke down completely while discussing a childhood memory I had shared, a school play where she had left early to attend Serafina's gymnastics competition. "I don't even remember doing that," she sobbed, genuinely distressed. "There are so many moments you've mentioned that I just don't remember, but I can see how much they hurt you." "That's part of the problem," I replied gently. "These weren't memorable moments for you, but they were formative for me." Outside of therapy, I focused on building my new life. The Hawthorns, the estate I had inherited, became my home after some thoughtful renovations to make it my own, while preserving my grandparents' essence. Working with Mr. Davies, I established the Sterling Legacy Foundation, dedicating a portion of my inheritance to supporting overlooked students with academic potential but insufficient family support. The foundation became my passion, a profound way to honor my grandparents while transforming my own painful experiences into something constructive. Each scholarship recipient reminded me of myself at that age, hungry for validation and opportunity. Being able to provide both, along with mentorship, healed parts of me I hadn't realized were still wounded. Serafina and I began meeting for coffee every other week, separate from our family therapy sessions. These conversations, awkward at first, gradually evolved into something resembling genuine sisterhood. "I always envied you," she confessed during one such meeting 6 months into our new relationship. "You were so smart, so capable." Mom and Dad made everything so easy for me that I never developed confidence in my own abilities. And I envied you, I admitted. You had their love and attention without having to earn it. This new honesty between us, painful as it sometimes was, created space for an authentic connection that had never existed before. My relationship with my parents progressed more slowly. Years of entrenched patterns couldn't be undone in months, and there were setbacks. My father, in particular, struggled with the loss of authority and the raw acknowledgement of his failures. But there were also moments of genuine effort, like when he asked about the foundation's work or remembered details about my current projects without prompting. After the required 18 months of counseling were complete and the secondary trust funds were distributed as promised, I wondered whether our family's progress would continue or revert to old, comfortable patterns. To my relief and profound surprise, my parents requested to continue the therapy sessions, now paying for them personally. We've only just begun to understand, my mother explained when I expressed my surprise. I don't want to lose the progress we've made. 2 years after my grandparents' passing, I stood in the sprawling rose garden of what was now my home, hosting the annual gathering for the Sterling Legacy Foundation scholarship recipients and their mentors. Serafina was helping serve refreshments, her natural social skills making the teenagers feel welcomed and valued. My parents had attended briefly, still somewhat uncomfortable in this setting, but making an effort that would have been unimaginable before. As twilight fell and the party wound down, I found myself alone in Grandma Agnes's beloved rose garden, the intoxicating scent of late summer blooms filling the air. I could almost feel her presence beside me, could almost hear Grandpa Walter's gentle chuckle from the study window. You were right, I whispered to their memory. Family is about character and doing right by each other, especially when it's difficult. The journey of healing hadn't been easy. There had been days when grief overwhelmed me, when anger at decades of dismissal threatened to consume me, when forgiveness seemed impossible. Therapy had helped me process these complex emotions to forgive without forgetting, to establish healthy boundaries while remaining open to genuine change. The most valuable inheritance my grandparents left wasn't the money or property, substantial as they were. It was the model of integrity they provided, the wisdom they shared, and their unwavering belief in my worth. When I struggled to see it myself, they showed me that true family isn't always defined by blood, but by those who see you clearly and love you completely. My story isn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. My parents still sometimes slip into old patterns. Serafina and I still navigate occasional jealousies and misunderstandings. The profound difference now is that we face these challenges honestly, without the pretense that everything is perfect when it isn't. I've learned that healing doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending the pain never existed. It means acknowledging the wounds, understanding their origins, and choosing a different path forward. It means accepting that some relationships will never be what we wished for in childhood, while remaining open to what they might become with work and honesty. Most importantly, I've learned that my value was never dependent on my parents' ability to see it. Just as Grandpa Walter told me at my high school graduation all those years ago, my worth exists independently of others' recognition of it. That knowledge, more than any financial inheritance, is the true gift my grandparents left me. So, if you've ever had to deal with family favoritism or felt overlooked and undervalued, know that you are not alone. Your worth is inherent, not something to be earned or granted by others. My journey taught me that sometimes the hardest truths lead to the deepest healing. It takes courage to confront these dynamics, and even more courage to choose a path of authenticity, whether that path leads to reconciliation or to establishing clear, healthy boundaries. What are your thoughts on my story? Have you experienced similar family struggles, and how did you navigate them? I'd love to hear your experiences and insights in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more real-life experiences and lessons. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by external validation. Thank you for listening, and remember, Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what's in the will, but the wisdom and strength we gain through life's toughest challenges.